Wait, hold on. What? Shane, am I starting now? Is that okay? Okay. Minus the coin toss because that has already been done. All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. Yeah, sorry for the technical issues. Sorry for the technical issues, everyone. We are working on the audio. It may feedback periodically throughout, but good evening, and thank you everyone who showed up, both in person and online. My name is Eldon Buckner, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Northern Review, your independent student media outlet. Tonight, we are excited to bring you a discussion between college Democrats and college Republicans on abortion and immigration. The topics were chosen by consensus of the two teams in identifying what they deemed to be some of the most important issues of contemporary American politics. The questions were unanimously approved by the Northern Review's editorial board and sent to the debaters 24 hours ago. We will be following the Lincoln Douglas format tonight, with the first speaker to be decided by coin toss. We already did that. Don't worry about it. College Republicans is going first. We already welcomed them. Do you want to welcome them again? We are joined by Jacob Ashley, Wesley Crockett, Annika Barrios, and Nicholas Bauman from the College Republicans. And the Democrats are represented by Logan Hara, Michael Kirchner, and Allison Ringsher. Tonight, both organizations' presidents are here. They already shook hands, so it's civil enough. So our initial debate question is, in 1937, Roe v. Wade established a due process clause of the 14th Amendment included the right to obtain an abortion. In 2022, Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization overturned this ruling. Was this ruling in Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization a valid ruling?
Thanks, Eldon. Everyone hear me okay? Okay, awesome. I appreciate the chance for a practice run.
Yeah.
First, I'd just like to quickly thank Northern Online for hosting, College Democrats for joining us in this discussion, and everybody watching here in person or online for being a part of this incredibly important discussion. So I believe that abortion is the greatest human rights crisis of our time. Over 900,000 abortions, over 900,000 children are killed in abortion every year, and this number is only increasing. Over 50,000 of these abortions are committed against children whose nervous systems have developed enough so that they can feel pain as their bodies are forcibly ripped apart or crushed within the womb. The question Eldon asked specifically was one about the recent Dobbs decision, which overturned the 1973 Roe decision. I'd like to quickly go over the faulty legal reasoning of Roe v. Wade. I would like to quickly go over the faulty legal reasoning of Roe v. Wade, and then I'll go into the issue of abortion more broadly. So in 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that there was a right to abortion. That there was a right to abortion in the Constitution. They found this imagined right to abortion in the 14th Amendment, specifically the Due Process Clause, which states, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." The Supreme Court justices in 1973 conferred a right to privacy from the stated right to liberty and a right to legalized abortion from this right to privacy. The Roe v. Wade decision is regarded as a masterclass in poor legal reasoning and judicial activism by pro-life and pro-choice legal experts alike. The most telling example of this, I think, comes from the law clerk of the author of Roe v. Wade himself, a man named Edward Lazarus, who, although, by his own account, he was utterly committed to the right to choose, he had this to say about the decision itself, quote, "As a matter of constitutional interpretation and judicial method, Roe borders on indefensible, and, quote, a constitutional right to privacy broad enough to include abortion has no meaningful foundation in constitutional text, history, or precedent." Now, although the Roe v. Wade decision is obviously flawed, and the decision to overturn it last summer was the correct decision, I think the due process clause is still relevant to our discussion here today. The Supreme Court pointed to the right to liberty stated in this clause. I would like to point to the right to life. And I think it's of note that the right to life is stated before the right to liberty. And that is because life is not merely one right among many, but it's the fundamental right upon which all other rights rest. You can't have any rights unless you have the right to life. And the right to life is the issue that we're discussing here today. And yes, it is a human life. Even aside from last summer's Dobbs decision, there is a vast array of legal precedent that affirms the idea that the unborn child in the womb is a living human being. The Unborn Victims of Violence Act, which is a national law still on the books, considers a child in the womb to be a legal crime victim if they are injured or killed in the commission of a crime. A vast majority of the states, 38 out of 50, recognize the unlawful killing of an unborn child to be homicide. The lawful killing of the same unborn child is what we call healthcare. Even if none of this legal precedent existed, there is still an undeniable biological reality that unborn children are human beings from the moment of conception. At conception, a complete and unique human genetic code is created with sex, height, eye color, and many other characteristics, including some of personality, are all determined at conception. A leading study on this issue can be found in the National Library of Medicine. In this study, over 5,500 biologists from over 1,000 academic institutions around the world were surveyed, and there was a 96% consensus that human life begins at conception. I'd like to finish this with a quote from the American College of Pediatricians, which says, quote, "The predominance of human biological research confirms that human life begins at conception, fertilization. At fertilization, the human being emerges as a whole, genetically distinct, individuated, zygotic living organism, a member of the species Homo sapiens, needing only the proper environment in order to grow and develop. The difference between the individual in its adult stage and in its zygotic stage is one of form, not nature." You may have heard an unborn child referred to as a fetus. I think it's important to note that fetus is simply the Latin word for child. The two are interchangeable. You might also have heard euphemisms such as clump of cells, which we all are, and the more horrific, the parasite, being used to refer to one's own child developing from the womb. I hope you are all well the use of such euphemisms to describe human beings. The pro-life position is simple. We believe that all human life has inherent value and is worthy of protection, regardless of size and regardless of convenience. Furthermore, it is our role as citizens and self-government to get legislation passed that protects innocent life without exception and without compromise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now pass it over to our Democrats for their cross-examination.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for a good speech there. We do have a couple of critiques of it. And we have a couple of claims that you made that we are kind of questioning about. One thing that you mentioned was the ability of a fetus to experience pain. And you kind of hinted at that being like the main part of moral consideration of that fetus. If we are considering pain as our primary, I guess, signifier of moral consideration, that has some wide implications for other moral debates. And I'm not sure if you want to completely commit yourself to that. One such thing is veganism. A lot of animals feel pain, even ants feel pain. Is that what we want to use as our line? There are other lines we can draw, like sentient, like whether or not you can reason, other stuff like that. But I'm not sure if you want to commit fully to pain, which we're fine with whatever you set, but pain is kind of an interesting marker there. One thing that we also want to talk about is about what legally considers a human being. And our Constitution has no real definition for it. There are some statutes that have some definition of person. And there is a distinction between a moral person and a legal person that does exist. And maybe we should change our laws to make it that way, to make them closer together. But at least under most statutes, the human being is considered to be someone that is born alive. Now, can we morally draw the distinction somewhere sooner? Maybe. In most of the rest of the world, and with the standard of Roe, we set that standard at viability, meaning that is when a baby can be born outside of the mother's womb and survive on its own. So we kind of want to know what your standard is and your reasoning for that, because there's like a question about what determines a human life from any other life. There could be an argument that you could be anthropocentric in some way, because in some cases animals do deserve some moral consideration. And there's kind of a question of when do we draw that line? And is it at conception, or do we want to draw it somewhere else? And also, one thing that was kind of not present was consideration of women, and that's something that we'll probably go into in our own speech here in a bit. But we would like to hear some more stuff about that. One of the many things that we noticed is that, I'm not sure how much time I have, but
You
we'll go
You
to
have
that.
7 seconds. All right.
Okay.
All right. Now we will be moving on to our Democrats' constructive speech.
Okay. Thank you all very much for coming. Whether it is virtual or in person, I would like to thank Northern Review for setting up this debate and college Republicans for agreeing to come. Here? Better? In the summer of 2020, Dobbs v. Jackson was decided upon into the Supreme Court. This decision restricted women's rights to an abortion and further criminalized women's bodies. There are countless women that were affected of this, and countless stories that would happen after this decision, and these are only 2 of them. PBS.org reported a 10-year-old girl in the state of Ohio who had to travel to Indiana after the Dobbs decision to procure an abortion. Ohio had then a heartbeat bill that restricted abortion after the 6-week point. Anyone who helped this poor child get an abortion in the state of Ohio would have been criminalized, as well as maybe the child herself. ABCNews.com reported 5 women suing the state of Texas under their SB 8 bill, which restricts abortion after the 6-week point. 3 of these women had to travel outside the state of Texas to procure an abortion, 1 all the way to Seattle. 2 women were induced to deliver their stillborn children and would have put their lives at risk and caused permanent damage to their bodies because abortion was not allowed in their state. These 2 women had heartbreaking medical conditions with their children, and their children would not have survived out of the womb no matter what. But the state of Texas did not allow abortions past 6 weeks. So it was determined that once the fetus could not live outside the womb, and once the woman put herself in danger to try to keep this child alive, it was determined that she had to be induced to deliver them. Because of these stories and countless more, we argue that abortion should be allowed until the viability point, and after that point, the decision should be left up to the states. Now, the question is regarding Dobbs' viability. Legally, Dobbs has nothing wrong with their viability. It was decided upon in our Supreme Court through a process that every other Supreme Court case has been decided upon since Marbury v. Madison, which established judicial review. However, we doubt the conclusions that came of the Dobbs reasoning and how they came upon this reasoning. Dobbs argues that women do not have equal right to an abortion under the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. This definition says that liberties are limited to those that existed within the history and tradition of the American government. However, history and tradition does not agree with the Dobbs decision at all. Before Roe, the standard for abortion was around 15 weeks. This is what was determined as the viability point of the standard of medicine at this time. Roe took this a step further. They used modern science of the 1970s to determine that viability was around 23 weeks. They allowed abortion up to this 23-week point by their definition of the 14th Amendment. Their 14th Amendment stated that the rights of American citizens included those that are defined in the Constitution as well as more that could have been debated upon, and that citizens have more liberties than are described in the Constitution. This definition has been used in countless more Supreme Court cases after Roe was decided, which included contraceptives, gay marriage, interracial marriage, personal security in general, and so many more. Meaning Roe's definition of the Due Process Clause was used in numerous other Supreme Court cases, securing the rights of American citizens that they are now able to exercise. But after the Dobbs decision, this definition is thrown out of the window, meaning many of the Supreme Court cases now stand on shaky reasoning because of a Supreme Court case, being Dobbs, that was decided upon on faulty reasoning. Now, Roe, because of this, was more argumentatively and historically valid than Dobbs ever was and ever will be. Now, ignoring legality for a moment, abortion should be allowed for numerous reasons. The U.S. has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in all developed countries. Maternal mortality rate is how many women die giving live birth per 100,000. If abortion were to be outlawed, this number would only increase. So many women and girls are already dying because states have outlawed abortions and they need this life-saving care, or else both them and their fetus will die. Now, there are, as I said, many reasons why women get abortions. Women could have been sexually assaulted, and they feel that they cannot carry their rapist child as they have already been extremely traumatized. Many women who get abortions are in poverty, and they cannot care for their child that they would deliver and their other children, meaning they would leave their family destitute. Some women have complications with their child, meaning their child could not survive out of the womb, and they would need an abortion to save their life. Now, we acknowledge that the fetus's life and its existence is viable and valid. However, to force a woman to give birth to a child that may not even survive childbirth and or might kill the woman has more consequences than abortion itself and undermines the definition of the protection of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, because of this, we argue that abortion should be allowed until the viability point, and after that point, states should be allowed to make the decision as to after this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move on to the cross-examination by our Republicans.
Okay, so there's a couple things you said that I would like to address specifically. Michael, you said that I said that I consider being able to feel pain as some sort of moral standard. I did not say that at all. I was very clear that human life begins at conception and its value therefore begins at conception. I was merely citing the fact that over 50,000 of these abortions do cause the fetus pain to illustrate the atrocity of abortion. However, I believe that from the moment of conception, a human life has value, and therefore pro-life legislation should be passed without compromise and without exception. So you hear the term forced birth a lot. Pro-life laws force women to give birth. I reject this language. Birth is a natural process. The force occurs when you kill the child within the womb. So we're not forcing anyone to give birth. The laws we propose merely prevent the killing of these unborn children. Secondly, I heard mentioned that we're trying to put laws on women's bodies. First of all, I would like to say that none of us have complete bodily autonomy. None of us own our bodies. There are plenty of illicit substances we can't put into our bodies. We're not allowed to sell our bodies via prostitution across the country. We're not even allowed to kill ourselves. So the idea that we have complete control to do what we want with our bodies is false. And furthermore, the issue of abortion does not primarily impact the woman's body, but impacts the body with a distinct genetic code that is within the mother's womb. You mentioned how the Dobbs decision overturned precedent and how there wasn't precedent in American history for anti-abortion laws. There have been laws banning abortion in this country for over 200 years. In fact, in 1829, New York State banned abortion entirely at every stage. So we have a history of banning this horrific procedure. You talked about how if abortion is outlawed, more women will die from abortion. You hear often that illegal abortions are extremely dangerous procedures for the women. This is not the case. In fact, the mortality rate of hip surgeries is about 10 times that of illegal abortion for the woman. Regardless, though, and you also mentioned poverty, how women might not be able to support their child. And I would like to mention the fact that there are about 3,000 pro-life pregnancy centers throughout the U.S. whose goal is to provide free medical care, counseling services, and material assistance in the form of diapers and baby clothes to women struggling with unplanned pregnancy. So there are plenty of resources for women who feel like they might not be able to support their child. Thank you.
We will now be moving on to our initial team's rebuttal. Yep.
Okay.
People against abortion are oftentimes labeled anti-women, and I understand where you're coming from. We're not giving women a choice, or we're not allowing them to have a choice to have an abortion. But as a Christian woman myself, I think abortion is a reflection that we have failed women. Society has failed to meet the needs of women, and we have settled for far too little. We deserve better options. I hope we can all agree life begins at conception, thus abortion is murder nonetheless. I do not believe we are here arguing whether killing a life is more permissible or not. I believe the argument today is how, as humans, we have let society promote a culture that life is disposable and that women are not offered choices of sex education, healthcare, and birth control. Increasing access to all these options would make abortion unnecessary, and many people believe in feminism, and feminism should be pro-life. Women are capable of giving birth and are greater capable of raising a child, and I don't know why abortion would be used to stop that, a natural thing.
So specifically, I heard mentioned that you support abortion access until the fetus is viable, and then afterwards it should be up to the states. I believe that was your position. Okay. So the issue with these arbitrary lines drawn on a child in the womb is that they don't mean anything. The viability line changes every year with the advancement of medical technology. Are we really saying that our morality is dictated by the state of our technology? I don't think so. Any line that you draw, whether that's heartbeat, first breath, or viability, changes with the advancement of technology and should not be our moral standard. Our moral standard is simply that life begins at conception and is worthy of protection from conception. And that's not because it can feel pain, but because it is a human life, which makes it more valuable than the life of an animal. And it deserves to be protected by our law.
Okay. Thank you very much. We will now be moving on to our Democrats' rebuttal. We have 6, yes.
So we feel it's important to mention that, morally speaking, it is perfectly reasonable to be pro-life. It's a perfectly reasonable position to have. A major issue, though, is that moral position doesn't translate the best into a legal position. You believe, our opponent believes that the Constitution guarantees unborn children the right to life. But what other constitutional rights should these unborn children be given? Should they be given the right to due process? If a pregnant woman commits a crime, is she not allowed to be arrested because the fetus did not commit a crime, and therefore you're holding it unjustly? These are very particular concerns that we should consider when we're talking about whether or not a fetus has rights. Because no one just gets the right to life. There are many rights in the Constitution. So why would we stop at a fetus given this argument? More importantly, there's also the consideration of what has been happening because of these laws. We mentioned earlier the 10-year-old girl, and you talk about valuing the life of children. It's well known the types of harms that can be done to a woman when she gives birth, and that's an adult woman. She can be scarred for life, have severe injuries. And you want to do that to a little girl? You think a little girl should be forced to have a baby? You mentioned as well that pregnancy is a natural process, and therefore you can't force someone. Eating is a natural process, but but there's such a thing as force feeding people. And you also mentioned these clinics that assist women, but what they don't give women is maternity leave. They don't give women food to feed the children for the rest of their lives. These women make the decisions they do oftentimes because they have other children they have to take care of, and they can't take care of anymore. Oftentimes it's because they're afraid of what's going to happen if they have this child. Perhaps they could suffer a more severe death because it can't be taken care of if it gets sick or hungry. And finally, you mentioned all the resources that we should be making available for women, that we failed women. I agree with you. I think we need to make those resources available. And I think it's absurd that the pro-life movement has spent so long not focusing on banning abortion rather than making those resources available. Because you seem to agree that if those resources were available, abortions would likely not happen because there would be no reason for it other than health. And I think it's hard to argue that a woman who's in danger, who's going to feel pain, and who might be permanently disabled or die from a pregnancy shouldn't be helped. I think that it's absurd that you would suggest or that you would ignore the fact that those women are going through that. Finally, you also mentioned when life starts. Carl Sagan once said that life is an ever-going process, going all the way back to the first human ancestors. Every sperm, every egg is alive in the scientific sense that it has cells, that it needs sustenance, etc. The same arguments that are used for science for a fetus. They also, likewise, all have the same potential. A sperm and an egg could become a born baby. A fetus could become a born baby. So do you also think that we need to ban or that we need to mandate vasectomies, temporary ones, in order to protect sperm? Or that we need to put women on puberty blockers or birth control in order to prevent them from losing their eggs during their periods? I think it's clear, based on your line of argument and the laws that could exist and the laws that do exist, this is untenable legally. It's going to cause laws against women's rights to choose are going to cause far more harm than good. It's going to hurt far more women and potentially countless other people. And it already has. As we mentioned, there are tons of women facing severe health issues because they aren't given the health care they need. They're forced to give birth to fetuses that have already died because doctors are afraid, based on how the law is written, that they will be prosecuted for this. So women are constantly at risk of death in order to give birth to something that's dead. This is unjustifiable. Dobbs points, almost every article it uses to justify its arguments stops at either 20 weeks or 15 weeks. Yet we've seen Dobbs be used to make bans at 6 weeks. Even if you want to argue abortion should be limited somewhat, there is no good argument for limiting it that early. Every other nation limits it at about 20 weeks. Even in the 19th century, the vast majority of limits were at 15, and that was due to the same logic that Roe versus Wade used in its decision making. Science has updated since then, and it's clear that the 20 to 22 weeks where we've had it in America is the far more reasonable position. Thank you.
Now we move on to our Republicans' final rebuttal.
I would love to address each one of the points you made. First of all, it's absurd to compare a sperm to a growing and developing human being. Yes, every cell in our body is alive, but every cell is not a human being with a distinct genetic code. In fact, every cell in our body bears our own unique genetic code. And from the moment of conception, the zygote bears a unique genetic code that has never been seen in human history. So it is a unique human being that does deserve the right to life, not a sperm or an egg or a skin cell. There is an obvious medical distinction to be made there. Moving on from that, I think absolutely. You said if we give an unborn child the right to life, then shouldn't he have a right to due process or something else? No, not the same way that a child outside the womb would have the right to due process, or an adult would have the right to due process, because the child is at a different stage of its life. And at the stage of life we're discussing, the child is within the mother's womb and is unable to be separated from the mother. So that doesn't mean you can kill the child, but just like an 8-year-old doesn't have the right to smoke a blunt and go for a joyride, you don't have the right to kill the child within the womb. So your rights are in some ways dependent on your age. The right to life, on the other hand, is for all human beings of all ages, and our laws should respect that. So you talked about how even if these pro-life pregnancy centers that I mentioned support a woman through pregnancy, they might not support her in raising her child after childbirth. That's true. There are plenty of women that might not be able to financially support a child. And that is why in America, it is very easy to give your child up for adoption. In fact, it is free of charge to give your child up for adoption. And the adoption agencies, sorry about that, placing a child up for adoption is free within the United States. The adoption agency you partner with will actually pay for some of the services associated with your pregnancy, including doctor visits, medical bills, and even attorney fees. And also now, there are things called baby boxes, which legally permits a mother in crisis to safely and anonymously surrender her newborn. And there are these baby boxes across the country in hospitals and fire stations. So, you're correct. It might be difficult to go through a pregnancy, and it might be difficult to give birth. I absolutely acknowledge that it is, and I have the utmost sympathy for women in difficult situations. That's why I support any measure possible to help them financially or emotionally. The method I do not support is executing the unborn child. Thank you.
Thank you very much for both parties explaining their positions. We now will be moving on to our issue of immigration. Question is, in 1965, new U.S. immigration laws replaced a national quota system. Since then, Congress has not been able to agree on how to address immigration, leaving many policy decisions up to the courts and the executive branch. What, if anything, is the most important problem within the immigration system, and how should it be addressed by the legislature?
Thank you again. There is a crisis at our southern border. It is a crisis that is endangering and ruining the lives of countless migrants and refugees, as well as making America a more dangerous, less prosperous place. It is not a crisis of under-policing. It is a crisis of over-policing. It is a crisis in which our government and its systems are more interested in detaining families looking for a better life in the United States than the criminals who bring drugs across the border. The system needs to be reformed, and it needs to be reformed by encouraging more encouraging more legal immigration, giving the means to do so because immigration is economically good. We also need to decriminalize and provide citizenship for those immigrants who have come to the country. We also, lastly, we need to streamline the process. We need to make it easier for migrants who have asked to enter the country to get into the country or have their claims researched and concluded. To your question and to the history of this issue, the 1965 immigration bill was the first time in American history that the southern border had any limitations on how many people could cross it at a time. Before then, there was no quota. And this change was done by accident. The point of the bill was actually to change the rules of immigration on the eastern hemisphere. That's Asia, Europe, Africa. And it was to set an equal quota for every country in Asia, Europe, and Africa in order to prevent discrimination against Asians and Africans. Unfortunately, Congress did not properly give consideration to our southern border, and every nation below us, as well as above us, has the same quotas. Continuing on from there, the more militarized border that we see today largely started with the Clinton and Bush senior administrations when they first started building and reinforcing the border wall. It continued on from there until we finally got to President Trump, who took immigration restrictions in a direction far more severe than we'd seen in most of our lives. Trump limited legal immigration severely. He increased penalties for undocumented immigration, and finally, and possibly most importantly, he chose to detain migrant children in facilities that are structurally equivalent to a prison, and he did so for seemingly no good reason. The Biden administration has continued many of these policies, unfortunately, and despite such heavy restrictions, countless migrants still cross the border, countless detainees are still deported, countless deportations still happen, and countless drugs still cross the border. Clearly, this isn't working. What we need to do instead is we need to encourage immigration, at least not to the criminal kind. And because immigrants, as they are today, are great for the economy. In 2019 alone, they paid $500 billion in taxes, and they get basically no federal benefits. Only a handful even do, and it's only after 5 years of being here. So they give much more than they take in terms of our economy. There's also the issue recently of the mass retirements post-pandemic and the inflation that's partly been caused by it. We still have a lot of jobs in America that need to be filled, and migrants could easily fill many of those jobs. We also need to decriminalize illegal immigration and provide a path to citizenship for many of the illegal undocumented immigrants that are already in here. So part of the reason for this is that there are two reasons. One is that ICE and the Department of Justice need to focus on more serious crimes. Crossing a border is not a particularly serious crime compared with drug trafficking and violence. What we need to do instead is we need to focus on those crimes. And drug trafficking doesn't come the way that undocumented immigrants come. Drug trafficking comes from the legal ports of entry through commercial trucks and other vehicles. So they're coming through the legal paths that already exist. No wall is going to stop that. There's also the issue of communities where undocumented immigrants exist not being willing to work with police because they want to protect these undocumented immigrants who are community members and friends. So the undocumented immigrants will not work with the police because they are fearing being deported. And many of the community members also won't work with the police for the same reasons. This makes police's job incredibly difficult. To the extent that ICE and the DOJ need to focus on non-port of entry immigration, it should be specifically to ensure that no one dies taking the extremely hazardous journey into the United States. Finally, we need to streamline the process. One of the main reasons we need to streamline the process, and going back to the undocumented immigrant issue, is that the vast majority of migrants who cross the border are asylum seekers. They're here as refugees seeking asylum, which is a human right that is recognized internationally. These are families trying to escape from those threatening them, and we have no right to deny them that opportunity.
Thank you, College Democrats. We now move on to our Republicans cross-examination.
Thank you. So Logan, you said that we over-police the border, and that that's one of the problems. Well, I argue that it's easier to cross when there's nobody around. It's just like a store with less protection and less security measures. People are going to want to rob the store when there's less security. We don't have enough security measures in place at the southern border right now. We need to increase ICE presence. We need to build the wall. We need to increase these measures that will decrease the access to illegally cross our borders. And the next point that I would like to refute against is the speeding up, or how the process is so slow. I would say, why would you wait to go and get approved legally when you can just get across the border? We make it way too easy for these immigrants to get across the border. We see them coming in giant groups of people in trains from Southern America, and we know that they're going to come to the border, but we don't do anything to stop it. We know they're coming. We should have measures in place to stop these people illegally coming from Latin America, Southern America, where we have plenty of time to know that they're coming. And then the last point that I'd like to push back against is how illegal immigrants who are caught after coming across the border are treated. The first interaction you have with the country cannot be breaking the law. You break the law as a citizen in the country, you get took to jail. So if you break the law as an illegal immigrant coming across the border and you get caught, you should expect to get treated like a criminal, just like a citizen would. So that's the main points that I had to push back against.
We now move on to the Republicans' constructive speech.
Okay. So there are many problems with the immigration system here in the United States, and I think that is something we can all agree on. A few of these problems include the issue of securing the border, the longevity of the process, and the family separation that does occur. The most important problem is the issue of securing the border. Once Congress can come to a compromise on how to do that, fixing the longevity of the process and the legal immigration system as a whole will come easier. The Department of Homeland Security states, protecting our borders from the legal movement of weapons, drugs, contraband, and people while promoting lawful trade and travel is essential to Homeland Security, economic prosperity, and national sovereignty. As you can see, the DHS is not appropriately responding to what is going on at the border, since there has been what many counties in Texas and Arizona have labeled as an invasion of undocumented immigrants, a surplus of opioids, most importantly fentanyl, entering our country and killing thousands, and the human trafficking of men, women, and girls. More than 5.5 million undocumented immigrants have entered the U.S. in the last 2 years, 2.76 million of which was in the fiscal year of 2022. 40 Texas counties, as of December 2022, have declared invasion due to the amount of undocumented immigrants coming in. The declaration of many of these counties state that the health, safety, and welfare of the residents are under an imminent threat of disaster from the unprecedented levels of illegal immigration, human trafficking, and drug smuggling coming across the U.S. border from Mexico. This crisis has occurred for a multitude of years, as you find that towns in New Mexico and Arizona have also declared states of emergency for this crisis before. In 2019, New Mexico declared a state of emergency as small towns could not keep up with the flow coming in. And in 2021, a small town in Arizona called a state of emergency as they did not have the resources or funds to support the migrants, many who, as our opponent has stated, are seeking asylum and making their home in America. However, we need to focus on helping our own citizens who are being affected by the undocumented immigrants flowing in. Many are scared to go outside in their communities for fear of possibly being robbed from those who are undocumented, and many towns, hospitals, and education centers are being overrun due to this influx. As stated earlier, an unintended consequence from the influx of undocumented immigrants is that of the opioids flowing into our river. This is an issue of national security, as we have seen enough fentanyl pour into our borders to kill every single American 5 times. In the fiscal year 2022, Customs and Border Protection found and confiscated over 50,000 pounds of fentanyl, not to mention all of the pounds that went unconfiscated. In 2021, more than 70,000 people in the U.S. died from synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl. I do applaud the Biden administration, as in March, they initiated Operation Blue Lotus, which is a DHS-led coordinated search effort to curtail the flow of illicit fentanyl smuggled into the United States from Mexico. In the first month of this operation, they seized 4,000 pounds of fentanyl. However, we cannot get excited yet because as it has seized a lot, that just means a lot more is flowing in. As found by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, China is supplying the Mexican cartels with fentanyl and synthetic opioid precursors so that they can manufacture and smuggle the lethal drugs into the United States. Another consequence is that of human trafficking. Human trafficking has become one of the largest issues facing our border security, with men, women, and children being exploited and forced into labor against their will. As found on clevelandrapecrisis.org, an estimated 60 to 80% of migrant women and girls experience rape and sexual assault during the migration process. This is becoming one of the world's most lucrative businesses, bringing in an estimated $150 billion annually for evil predators. So what should Congress do? If we underpolice the border again, there would be no ability to control the influx of the migrants coming in or properly check their backgrounds. So as the Republican stance, we feel that Congress needs to finish the wall, authorize the U.S. military to head to the border until the problem is under control, and then we can look to fixing the legal immigration system as a whole.
Thank you very much. We will now be moving on to our Democrats' rebuttal. Or, sorry, their cross-examination.
So you mentioned a lot states of emergency and panic caused by undocumented immigrants, but you never really discussed per se why undocumented immigration would justify such responses. High population is perhaps an issue, and that's one that I would agree we can find solutions to. But what is it that's so concerning to people about undocumented immigration? They don't commit crimes. The majority of undocumented, again, are not the ones bringing drugs across the border. The drugs are being brought across by cartels and trucks going through the legal entryways. So undocumented immigrants are hardly a part of a major issue. And in terms of letting them in or not letting them in, even if you don't let them in, you're just leaving them at our border by and large, where they will be taken in for human trafficking. And continuing on from that, you mentioned something about needing more security. As I mentioned, it's too much right now, and I stand by that. But the problem primarily is that the security is all in the wrong place. We're still focusing, as I mentioned, on these families, on trying to detain them, on trying to stop them, and the drugs are getting in anyways. The drugs are getting in from Americans, the drugs are getting in from legal ports of entry. So none of this is stopping the major issues. We're just focusing on these undocumented immigrants who are crossing the border hoping to seek asylum. And that is everything.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to our Democrats' initial rebuttal.
Yeah, we have a couple more points here that we want to talk about as the final rebuttal here. We do want to talk about the help of having undocumented immigrants here, and we kind of want to elaborate on the crime thing. First, the crime thing, undocumented immigrants don't commit much crime, and that's partially because if they get caught, they could easily get deported. There's no incentive for them to do so because the incentives against it are so drastic. Part of it is that they are refugees from countries all across South America, including some that we may have deposed their dictators in the 70s. There's plenty of regimes like El Salvador and Guatemala that we did a lot of the actions that may have caused their destabilization. And to me, at least, I feel like we have at least somewhat of a duty to maintain at least their dignity of these people, and not just treat them as criminals for trying with as much effort as they can to get somewhere safe. And I think we all agree that America is a good country and a good place for safety, and also, at least we hope, a champion of human rights. And having this wall here, blocking people from getting in, having a very long process for people to get here legally, is denying people their human rights. Now, as far as the drug thing, as Logan mentioned, it is a thing where it is going through legal points of entry, and your criticisms of our argument do not really address that much. And to me, at least, the main problem with undocumented immigrants is that they are not documented. Documentation is essential for what we do for our economy. We need it for things like businesses. They need to know how many people are there so they can figure out how much stuff to buy for their company. We need it for our government to know how many people are there as well. Any economist needs good information. And we don't really think of it as much of a crime that needs deportation. Maybe we can make it a misdemeanor or something like that, but to say, hey, you crossed here illegally, you are a criminal, and you need to be deported, is a monstrosity, because it is destroying their rights and their dignity as human beings, which I'm assuming you care about from the previous debate. So, the wall just, it's unhuman. It's destroying dignity of so many people that are coming here from problems that we helped cause, whether or not those were good causes, maybe from the Cold War, but there is a history there, and there are living people that need to have their rights respected.
One more point. I would just like to say that fentanyl and the drug trafficking is not a new issue. We saw this issue in the 1970s with the Medellin cartel from Pablo Escobar, with meth being trafficked into the United States. Fentanyl is a new drug and is very deadly and is a problem in the United States.
Thank you very much. We will now be moving on to our Republicans' secondary rebuttal. Correct.
Okay. You guys talked a lot about human rights, and yes, we do respect those a lot, and that is why we support having a strong border, because without a strong border, you cannot have a country. But if we don't have a strong border, then these immigrants can think that they can come up and cross the border legally, which leads to a whole host of problems for the immigrants, which we want to protect them as much as we can on their journey, which is why we want to do our most to persuade them to not try to migrate illegally. As Leslie mentioned previously, 60 to 80% of migrant women and children are raped and or experience sexual violence on their trip from their host country to America. And actually, a lot of kids are given birth control and Plan B because it's expected that they will experience a sexual assault or rape on their journey. Going more into the human rights aspect of it, we want to make sure that the kids are done well once they get into the country. And the Biden administration has lost almost 20,000 migrant children once they cross the border. Representative Andy Briggs from Arizona, he asked the Department of Health and Human Services for information on unaccompanied alien children who were released to sponsors and 19,726 of those sponsors didn't respond. So that is almost 20,000 migrant children who are in the country where we don't know where they're at. That leads to a lot of sex trafficking, human trafficking, which we all agree up here is not a good thing. And also, there's a lot of child labor laws being broke because these kids come here, migrants come here, they get jobs, they have to work whatever jobs that they can, and if they don't want to do the job, they can, get deported or deported. Over the last 2 years, 250,000 migrant children have come alone to the United States, and according to a New York Times investigation, thousands of these children have worked punishing jobs, such as overnight shifts at slaughterhouses, repairing roofs, and operating machinery in factories, which all violate child labor laws in the United States. And the Biden administration actually has been given, or have ignored these signs of rapid growth of child labor within the country, and they just chose to ignore it. And at least 5 health and human services staff members have raised complaints regarding this, and they got kicked out of their offices. And a little bit more on one more thing on the jobs that illegal immigrants are taking is the wages and their willingness to work in unsafe conditions, as I previously mentioned. Bernie Sanders actually is quoted for saying, "It does not make a whole lot of sense, or it does not make a lot of sense to me to bring hundreds of thousands of these workers into this country to work for minimum wage and compete with America's kids. We have minimum wage jobs are meant for kids, not meant for grown adults to work in. And by having a lot of these legal immigrants come in and take these jobs, they're taking away from potential jobs for the American workforce."
So I would just like to quickly address one of the fundamental premises that you are building your argument off of, and that is that there is a human right to enter this country illegally. And there isn't. Nobody has a right to enter this country illegally. And you said that we have no right to stop these people from entering our country. Actually, we do. And that's the entire purpose of self-government, is that we as citizens of this country get to decide how this country is run. And that means deciding through our elected officials how our border operates and how our immigration policy is enforced. So we have every right as American citizens to stop illegal immigrants from coming into our country, especially if we believe it to be detrimental, as I think Nick just outlined. Now, you also said that if we close the border, illegal immigrants are still going to come. They're just not going to be able to get in and therefore be trafficked. I don't think that's the case. If we build a wall and it is not possible to cross the southern border illegally, immigrants will not keep coming to the tune of several million per year to cross this border if they are aware that it is not possible to cross the border. So if you want something to go down, you don't subsidize it. If you want illegal immigration to go down, we shouldn't make it easier to get into the country. We should make it harder to get into the country, and we have every right as American citizens to do that.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to our Democrats' final rebuttal.
Thank you very much. Now, I would like to start at the beginning of the rebuttal. Now, we are not advocating for a complete end to border control. We are simply saying that there are many instances of violence at the border that is directed to the wrong people, that is directed to people who are trying to have a better life, who are trying to cross the border so that they can have a better life in the United States. And you mentioned several times about sexual assault and sex trafficking between undocumented and immigrant young girls. And of course, this is a very big problem. Now, this is also an issue of being immigrants undocumented, not necessarily inherently border control. Along with changing the border, we advocate to make it easier to become documented in the United States, which is already a very arbitrary process. Now, if more of these children were to become documented, then they could report the sexual assault against them and it would decrease. This also would be would help the solution to child labor laws. Because as we mentioned, child labor laws is also a very big issue because these children aren't documented, therefore our laws do not apply to them, and they are being forced, not necessarily forced, but they are doing this work that no children should. Now, we argue that there is a right to asylum, which is internationally recognized, not necessarily a right to illegal immigration.
Yeah, so you mentioned decreasing the incentives for undocumented immigration. One of the ways to do that is by improving the documentation process. So as it stands, most migrants have to wait 15 years to hear an answer back on whether they're allowed into the country or not. Immigration court, they have a backlog of cases of 7 million. That is absurd, and it is largely due to bureaucratic excess. And a lot of that came from the Trump administration. A lot of that excess needs to be removed. It didn't need to be there. Further, we need to hire more people to work for immigration court. We can speed up this process. We'll also mention a lot of things about the labor of children and migrants taking jobs. And as Allison pointed out, a lot of that is because they are undocumented. If they were documented, if they didn't have to fear being deported, they could better assert their rights to be paid the same wages as other Americans, and the risk of them being paid less would stop existing. The risk of these children being abused would exist less because they wouldn't have to be afraid to assert their rights to the government, to the law enforcement that they should be relying on. That's all.
Thank you very much. Can I get a round of applause for both of our teams? Thank you to everyone who came both virtually and in person. And I would like to thank Gabriel Ma for his effort and all of the work that he put in, as well as Madeline Markwood for everything that they put in to put this event together. Without them, this event wouldn't have been possible. The debaters, I would also like to thank the debaters for their preparation and participation, the university administration for allowing us to use the Bear Cave, and our audience, both in-house and watching virtually. Please consider following Northern Review on Instagram, as well as subscribing to our email list. Thank you very much. Have a good night. You guys to stay back for pictures, as well as you guys to stay back for pictures, okay? Cool. Thank you very much.